Hello everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University, where the 四海为学collaborative learning project is based. I want to welcome you to our 10th roundtable today. We have Professors Li Chenyang and Stephen Engel here to discuss with us their work on progressive Confucianism, which is the theme of this roundtable. We are happy to have Professor Ranjoo Herr, Professor Elena Ziliotti, and Sophia Gao here to discuss with Professors Li and Engel. Our chair today is Dr. Li Luyao from Peking University. And it's become a tradition here at 四海为学to give younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to take part as chairs or discussants. So if there's any younger scholars here in the audience who wish to be part of future events, please email me. This event will be 2 hours total and end promptly at noon Beijing time. Before getting started and handing things over to Dr. Luyao, I want to first say a few things about the 四海为学Collaborative Learning Academic Forum. The 四海为学Collaborative Learning Project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive conventional practices in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and "look at me, I'm smarter than you," or "don't I know so much," and similar attitudes sometimes found in academic exchanges. We might even go so far as to say that we hope to be the counterbalance for the negative attitudes sometimes found in blind reviews. While there is certainly a time and a place for anonymity, or at least the appearance of anonymity, communication in academia should have just as much time and place for speaking to one another on more congenial and community-forming settings. The neologism 四海为学, which was created by Robin Wong, is a play on 四海为家, and we hope to keep this idea in the foreground of all of our events. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project seeks to accomplish these shifts in orientation during academic exchange by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. We hope to foster environments where people truly learn from and with one another. So before introducing our chair, I want to once again thank all of the participants. I want to especially thank Professors Li Chenyang and Professor Engel for taking their time and sort of doing a little bit of extra work, adding to their workload. I also especially want to thank Professor Engel because his Warp Weft and Way project has also been very inspiring, I think, for myself and other people, and he's really helped us promote our events. So thank you especially for that, Professor Engel. Our chair today is Dr. Li Luyao. Luyao is a postdoc research fellow at Peking University, Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. She earned her PhD from the Nanyang Technological University, Department of Philosophy. Her research interests include Taoism, comparative philosophy, and political philosophy, with a special focus on harmony and freedom in the Zhuangzi. She has published papers on responsive harmony in the Zhuangzi and harmonizing virtuosities in the Zhuangzi. Luyao is very, very capable, and I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of her in academia in the coming years. So we're very happy to have you here, Dr. Luyao. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul, for organizing this amazing activity, and it's a great honor for me to chair this event. Please allow me first introduce the structure of this roundtable discussion. We will first invite Chenyang Li to present his views, and then there will for about 10 minutes, and then there will follow around 14 minutes discussion. After that, we will invite Professor Andrew to present his views, and then also a 40 minutes discussion. After that, we will open the discussion to everyone. If you have a question, you could ask Professor Andrew, Professor Li. Then I will first introduce Chenyang Li. Prof. Chenyang Li is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, also my advisor, where he founded the philosophy department. His primary areas of research are Chinese philosophy and comparative philosophy. He is the author of The Tao Encounters the West Exploration in Comparative Philosophy, The Confucian Philosophy of Harmony, Reshaping Confucianism, A Progressive Inquiry, and over 100 journal articles and also book chapters. His co-edited volumes include The Sage and the Second Sex, the East Asian Challenge for Democracy, Moral Cultivation and Confucian Character, Chinese Metaphysics and Its Problems, Harmony in Chinese Thought, The Virtue of Harmony. He was president of Association of Chinese Philosophers in North America and also president of International Society for Chinese Philosophy. And he is also the fellow. Also a fellow at the Center of Advanced Study in Behavioral Science in Stanford University. Welcome. Perfectly, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Luyao, and thank you, Paul, and thanks everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. I will share a screen and use a PPT. Hopefully, that will be helpful. Do you see the screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Progressive Confucianism, I believe, is a term coined by Steve Angle, and I borrowed this term, sort of borrowed from him. Elaborate the idea in this book, Reshaping Confucianism, a progressive inquiry. This is a book for those who are interested in. And I will briefly give a sketch of the main idea of this book. This book aims to kill two birds with one stone. That is, I both want to introduce some new ideas with in-depth studies on some key Confucian concepts, and to make it a book that can serve as a textbook in the classroom for people who are interested in having an overall view of progressive Confucianism. So that is kind of a double purpose. In the book, I have 12 chapters and covered 12 key concepts. The first three, harmony, care, 人, 和, 人, 理, I call the fundamental concepts. Then some social, political, social, self, and moral philosophy on 孝, 别, 有, and 寿. Then I have a special section on Sheng. And finally, the fourth chapter is about more or less political philosophy. That is 自由, 齐, 正, and 教. Now, these terms I borrow in Chinese do not necessarily represent exactly this meaning in English, and these Chinese words have been used in a variety of ways. But I use them as a kind of a link. You can use it to move back to the Chinese text, not as exclusive translation. Now, a few main background assumptions. I don't take Confucianism to be something like a Confucianism. I take Confucianism as Rujia is a living, evolving tradition, and not strictly kind of pinned to Confucius, the historical person. I think it's unfortunate in Western language, we translate Rujia into Confucianism, making the too close a connection between Rujia and Confucius. Of course, there is a huge connection, but Confucianism as Rujia is much broader and carries much more ideas than what Confucius as a historical person has actually offered us. And in other way, Confucianism or Rujia is still ongoing and still alive today. Another idea, along with the first point I'll make, is I want to acknowledge the fallibility of Confucianism. This long tradition for over 2,000 years, a large number of thinkers, a large number of texts attributed to this tradition. And naturally, they are not always consistent. And some ideas can be contradictory even. Ancient thinkers, no matter how much wisdom they had, they were confined by their times. Therefore, when we read classical texts today, classical thinkers in the Confucian tradition, we should bear in mind they are not 100% correct. They cannot be. They are not God. They are human. And in terms of approach, this is the first point of general assumptions. The second is approaches. I borrowed from Richard Rorty the classification of philosophical approaches. The first one he called historical reconstruction. The second he called rational reconstruction. Historical reconstruction more or less is kind of studying history of philosophy. We figure out what ancient philosophers said in ancient times. Rational reconstruction is to use our sensibility to imagine what ancient thinkers would say today if they were alive and know what we know. Following Rorty's classification, I use two categories as well, but instead of a rational reconstruction, I use a philosophical reconstruction versus the historical reconstruction, roughly kind of in parallel with the history discipline and the philosophy discipline, because I do see in the English speaking world, the people of these two different backgrounds often have a different understanding of what it means to study, to do Confucian philosophy. Now, use Rorty's metaphor. The historical approach, we deal with re-educated ancient thinkers. They were confined by their time and their own culture, and they said what they thought was, made the most sense to them. And in philosophical approach, we are dealing with Rorty called re-educated ancient thinkers. That is, we imagine what they would think, what they would say, given their overall philosophical orientation, if they were alive today and they know what they know. For example, the historical figure Confucius thought, I think he did hold such a view, that the two sexes are unequal. And today, if he were alive, I think he can be persuaded to change his view to agree that two sexes are equal. That is, re-educated Confucius would accept gender equality. One analogy I made in the book, the introduction, is these two approaches like we reconstruct an ancient house. Suppose the ancient house has merit worth reconstructing, preserving. Depending how our purpose is designed, we may use two different approaches. The historical approach will try to restore the house as close as its original state as possible, even though it has outdated designs or faulty material, even rotten parts. If we use the philosophical approach, we may modify this house. Today, for example, we may put in running water in the house and even add a modern bathroom in the house and air conditioning in the house. So we preserve the large contour of the house by and large and still can make it useful to us today. Now, in the Chinese, contemporary Chinese philosophy, there is, this is the only Chinese slide I have. Feng Yulai talk about the 照着讲 and 接着讲. We speak in accordance with ancient thinkers, or we continue their conversation that ancient thinkers started. I think these two classifications have some connection to the two approaches I put there, but I wanted to emphasize that when we 照着讲 is not necessarily means 照着做. Some we need to 照着做, we can continue to do accordingly, but other part we may not. And 接着讲, we need to decide how to 接着讲, is to be progressive or to do something different. And with these two approaches, I caution us we should not try to historicize Confucianism. By historicizing Confucianism, I mean the tendency to treat Confucianism exclusively as object of a historical study, and to use the criteria of historical approach to judge the philosophical approach. I think there is a tendency among people who do Chinese philosophy for going that way. And I do not oppose historical approach. I think it has its value, but we should not confuse these two and should not use historical approach to replace philosophical approach. The last part of my presentation has to do with the principle of progressive humanity. That is the theme of tonight's roundtable. In philosophical research, we usually follow the principle of charity and the principle of humanity. By principle of charity, we mean we need to try to interpret our thinkers, other thinkers, often our opponents, charitably, to try to make as rational reconstruction as possible, to make as much sense as possible, rather than distorting their views. And the principle of humanity is to imagine that if we were living in ancient time, as ancient thinkers did, we might have held the same view or similar view as they did. For example, I can imagine if I lived 2,000 years ago, I would have said that the two genders are unequal. I would have said, the male is superior to female if I had lived 2,000 years ago. So I understand why many people thought that way, even though today we disagree with them. Now, the third principle is what I want to promote, is I call it principle of progressive humanity. It is an enhanced principle of humanity. It is kind of reverse of the orientation of principle of humanity. That is to imagine ancient thinkers to come alive, to live in our time, to learn and to know what we know today, and what they would say instead of what they actually said in ancient time. And that helps us to maintain ancient thinkers' overall philosophical orientation and also to develop their ideas to serve the modern time and to address contemporary issues. One example I have is Mencius' idea of Ranjoo, right? Mencius was among the first, I think he was the first to came up with the idea that the people are the most important and the rulers are the least important. But he did not come up with the idea of democracy. He went as far as saying that if the ruler is really bad, then a revolution, a bloody revolution, justified. Now, if Mencius were alive today, given his overall orientation about the importance first, people first principle, now if he knows that there is a way of going democracy through peaceful election, we change the ruler, I think he would embrace democracy, even though he did not by himself in his time. In comparison, if other thinkers like Shang Yang and Han Feizi came alive today, given their overall philosophical orientation, they may not accept democracy because they clearly thought the ruler are the most important. Everything should be done to serve the interest of the ruler. So before closing, let me say a few words about what I mean by progressive. I use progressive with a lowercase p to indicate that it is not a specific brand of philosophy. And I use it as orientation. I think Elena mentioned this in her prepared comments. What do I mean by that? I think, on my understanding, progressive Confucianism is not a contemporary thing. Confucianism has always been progressive, but to different degrees. When Confucius first said we should have education regardless of class background, he was being progressive already against his time. And when Xunzi, think that your obligation to your father can, sometimes your obligation to the state, we would say today the public society, maybe weightier than your obligation to your father. I think in contemporary time, most of us would think he is being progressive in comparison with Confucius himself. So if you look at the history of Confucianism, it has been making progress all along. It's not a contemporary thing in the last 20 years or something. So again, this is the chapter that I have, and I will stop there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Li, for the presentation. And please allow me to introduce our our commentator, Prof. Ranjoo, sorry, Ranjoo is here. She is a professor of philosophy at the Bentley University. Her areas of research specialization encompass feminist, comparative, and political philosophies, and Ranjoo has published widely in venues such as philosophical theory, Hypatia, Meridians, Philosophy East and West, and many other journals. Her current research topics include collective self-determination, human rights, the colonial feminism, and gender equality across cultures. She is currently working on monography on Confucian feminism. Prof. Harry, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I'm very honored to be here. For the sake of time, I will just start without further ado. So starting with Chenyang's most recent book, I really appreciate the opportunity to carefully examine and comment on his most recent book. Although there are so many interesting ideas in the book, I will limit myself to Chenyang's conception of progressive Confucianism and his position on the Confucian-gender relation. Chenyang's conceptualization of progressive Confucianism is offered in the introduction, in which he states that progressive Confucianism must integrate two components. One, it must retain its Confucian characteristics by preserving an organic connection with its ancient sources and heeding the ancient Confucian thinkers' thoughts. Two, it must advance itself with sensibilities developed through contemporary experiences and address contemporary challenges. I wholeheartedly endorse this conception of progressive Confucianism and realize that I am a progressive Confucian, which I didn't realize. So one of the most urgent contemporary challenges to Confucianism that progressive Confucianism must meet is Confucian gender relations. As you may all know, Chenyang has been a pioneer in Confucian feminism in advancing a feminist conception of Confucian care ethics. Chenyang has had many scholarly exchanges with his critics and followers over the years, so I wasn't surprised that he does not revisit this issue in the book. Still, his chapter on Ren can be considered a solid justification for his Confucian care ethics. In it, Chenyang argues that there are two principal senses of Ren, one as a specific virtue and the other as a comprehensive virtue. He then argues that Ren as a comprehensive virtue is rooted in Ren as a specific virtue, with care as its central characteristic. I find his argument that Ren as a specific virtue boils down to caring plausible. I think he made a good case for that. However, I am not entirely convinced that Ren as caring is the root of Ren as a comprehensive virtue, which is the defining feature of Confucianism. I am aware that there isn't sufficient time for me to elaborate on this, but I hope to continue the conversation about Confucian care ethics with Chenyang in the future. I am completely on board, however, with his proposal for differentiated gender equilibrium in Chapter 5. Here, Chenyang argues for a harmonious Confucian spousal relation predicated on role differentiation without gender inequality. This is what he calls differentiated differentiations. The foundation of this idea is the reconceptualized yin-yang principle. Chenyang states that the harmony of yin and yang requires differentiation, which does not imply superiority or inferiority. In this reformulation, yin and yang are different yet equal, and each play a respective yet indispensable role in the relationship. A spousal relation based on this reconceptualization of yin-yang is neither rigid nor hierarchical. Indeed, each spouse, and I quote, can play both yin roles and yang roles simultaneously, but in different aspects of family life. In the meantime, neither yin nor yang, in some respects, show the inferiority or superiority of the whole person. Such a model provides a foundation for sex equality and gender equality with differentiation in the family." End quote. I find Chenyang's argument in this chapter quite plausible and compatible with my own view on the ideal Confucian spousal relationship. And I had published something similar to this in the past. There, I did not make the connection to yin-yang, but I really appreciate that Chenyang aptly utilizes the yin-yang principle in service of an egalitarian Confucian spousal relationship, which to me makes a lot of sense. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Here. Perfectly. You may have around 5 minutes to respond to Professor Harry's question.
Thank you. I realize I overused my presentation time, so I will be very brief. Ranjoo and I can have our private discussions, more discussion. I look forward to Ranjoo's new work. Thank you for your comments, Ranjoo, and you have done a lot of work in Chinese feminism, and I appreciate your work. I have drawn your ideas and inspiration. So I see your point that Ren as a specific virtue is more connected with care than Ren as comprehensive virtue, because Ren as a comprehensive virtue is much comprehensive and include a much larger scale of virtuosity. And my argument in the chapter is still rooted and anchored on care. And in Chinese, I think often when people talk about the Ren, they often move back and forth between what I call a specific virtue and a comprehensive virtue. And often you cannot tell exactly what they mean. I see that as an indication that ancient thinkers, including contemporary thinkers, actually see the close connection even with comprehensive virtue as a Ren, the connection with the care. That's my understanding. And I see your point, and more needed to be discussed on that. Now, thank you for your discussion of my yin-yang approach. My challenge is that, as I said, to develop a contemporary Confucianism, which we need to try to preserve good connections with the Confucian tradition, rather than just brought in something without integration with the tradition. So which part of the traditional Confucianism can be integrated when we talk about the gender relations, gender equality? Personally, I think the yin-yang idea is still useful if we give it the appropriate interpretation. I don't know how successful that is. You are very, very generous, Ranjoo. I wanted to hear your more critical view later. Looking forward to your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof. Li. Please allow me to introduce our second commentator, Elena Ziliotti. She is the Assistant Professor of Ethics and Political Philosophy at Delft University of Technology. She received her PhD in philosophy from King's College London and National University of Singapore joint PhD program in 2018. Before joining TU Delft, Elena was an international postdoctoral fellow at the School of Philosophy at Wuhan University and a recipient of the 2019 China International Postdoctoral Exchange Fellowship. Elena's research focuses on democracy theory and comparative political theory, with a particular focus on contemporary Confucian political theory. Her publications have appeared on American Political Science Review, Review of Politics, Journal of Applied Philosophy, and Critical International Review of Social and Political Philosophy. Elena's first book, Meritocratic Democracy Across Cultural Political Theory, was published last year by Oxford University Press. The book attempts to develop a new theory of democracy and integrate insights from both contemporary Western democracy theory and Confucian political thought, enriching discussion on democracy and political meritocracy.
Please. Thanks, Luyao, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. Thanks, Professor Li and Professor Engel, for writing this amazing book. I'm very pleased and honored to be part of this roundtable. And like Ranjoo, I wholeheartedly share Professor Li and Professor Engel's commitment to progressive Confucianism, and I endorse also their call for more open-mindedness in Confucian discourse. And I really found the debate surrounding progressive Confucianism really methodologically invigorating, because I think it really raises a crucial, important question at the moment on how Confucianism can and should adapt to shifting political but also moral. I think this is a really important question that is behind a lot of the works that we see in contemporary Confucian political philosophy, and these works are addressing this methodological issue directly. So I'm really interested in this conversation and to see how this discussion is going. My comment is really about the concept of progressive Confucianism. I'm really intrigued by this idea, and so I starting to zoom out from the Confucian perspective and connect the idea of progressive Confucianism with other parallel discussions on the concept of progressive or progress itself. And if we look at the concept of progress from this kinds of broader perspective, we have to acknowledge that this concept has a bad reputation in post-colonial or decolonial and cultural studies. So not so much in Confucianism maybe, but in other academic fields. And why this is so? Well, this stems from the fact that progress was coupled with other political concepts like democracy, development of human rights, primarily during colonial times. So it was imposed by colonizers and thinkers on colonies and also non-Western societies, has a kind of historically linear pathway to develop and achieve modernity. So implicit in this idea of progress is that the history is linear, follows a linear development, and at the end of this linear development, we have something called Europe, that was a fictional figure that didn't really reflect at all what Europe was in reality and what is now. But this fiction idea was the end point of the path that all societies worldwide are expected to traverse, and that's also the way in which we can distinguish developing countries from developed countries. So this concept has a kind of interesting baggage. And even so, if we think that some of these thinkers really also believe that if necessary, progress should be pursued even at the cost of destroying the native civilization. And here I think the classical example is Karl Marx's analysis of the British Raj. So he knew what it was happening in India during British colonialism, and he was completely fine in saying that, well, England has to fulfill a double mission there. One is really destroying the native civilization, and the other is bring lay down the material foundation of Western societies in Asia. So why I'm telling all this story? Well, because I think that obviously we all recognize that these issues are problematic. So we recognize the issue with this ideology. But this raises a really important question for people that are committed to progressive Confucianism, because it raises the question of that if Confucians refer to the concept of progress, then what progress are we alluding to? What is our endpoint of, if we agree, of a linear historical pathway? So what is the ultimate endpoint of the progress envisioned by contemporary Confucian scholars like Professor Li and Professor Engel? I think this is an important question that we have to address, primarily because I cannot foresee, but my hunch is that critics of progressive Confucianism, so what we might call conservative Confucians, might argue that Western original ideas are really driving the agenda of progressive Confucianism. So I think it's a criticism that we should anticipate. And so they might say that, well, really what is happening here is that Confucian intellectual ideas are occupying a position of subalternity. So conservative critics can argue that progressive Confucians' arguments for democracy, gender equality, are really not so much an internal critique of Confucianism, but that's what is really happening with the idea of progress that I mentioned before. So I think it will be very important from this very important methodological discussion and proposal of progressive Confucianism itself to really discuss clearly what is the endpoint for the so-called Confucian idea of progress. And I think I can conclude here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Ziliotti. Prof. Li, please.
Thank you, Elena, for your comments. I recently read your new book and really enjoyed it. And I think your views and mine converge a lot. So it's very good to meet you. On the concept of progressiveness, I think you raised a very important question. And people who do progressive Confucianism must be mindful of it. My view is this. First, I do not take progressiveness as necessarily teleological. I do not believe there must be an end point in order to make progress. I more or less share Richard Rorty's view on progress. The idea is that if something enables us to deal with the issues of our time better, then comparing with ancient time or the past is progress. For example, 100 years ago, there was people not talking about human rights. Today, we talk human rights. We get this idea of human rights. And it enables us to handle issues better. Therefore, that is progress. When I was growing up in China, I spent some time in the countryside. And this, when I was a teenager, even before I turned to be a teenager, in a village, men often made fun of women in a very explicitly sexual way. And women had no way to fight back. No matter what they said, the men always took over and, still say something even nastier. Now, later I realized that there is a concept of sexual harassment. Now we have a weapon to deal with that. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, there was no such concept in China. So today we have developed this idea. I think the philosophy of gender politics, political philosophy has progressed. I think that is what I mean by being progressive. It doesn't have to be linear. And also, I don't agree with Hegel that history is already kind of predetermined. It's just an unfolding, predetermined endpoint. I think we don't know the future. For example, today, how technology, AI leads us to go, we don't know. It's not determined. It could go different ways. Therefore, 100 years from now, the world would be different from today. They would need new tools. They would look back at us. They would need to progress from what we have offered, just have like we progressed from our, ancient thinkers. So basically, that is my idea. Now, I'm aware the critical view that progressive philosophers tend to take too much from the West. To me, no matter where the idea comes from, if it comes from a place in the West, then so be it. If from, Africa, so be it. As long as it can enable us to deal with our current challenges better. And go back to Richard Rorty's view. That's my answer. Thank you for your question, Elena.
Thank you, Prof. Li. Please allow me to introduce our third commentator, Sophia Feiyan Gao. She is a PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of New South Wales, supervised by Professor Karen Lai and Timothy O'Leary. She holds an MPhil in philosophy from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and her research focuses on preaching Confucian philosophy, feminist, moral philosophy, and comparative philosophy. Her current research project develops a hybrid Confucian feminist approach to nurturing interpersonal caring relationships, exploring creative ways to embody care through a dialogue between feminist care ethics and Mencius philosophy. Her publications addresses topics such as Confucian meritocracy, relational autonomy, and empowering care. Please, Sophia.
Thanks, Luyao, for the introduction, and many thanks to Professor Li for the insightful presentation, and I really enjoyed the book. Professor Li's book, Reshaping Confucianism, invites us on an exciting and rewarding journey of reimagining Confucianism through a contemporary lens. So myself, as a scholar exploring the dialogue between Confucian tradition and feminist care ethics, I have benefited tremendously from Professor Li's work. Its carefully chosen methodologies, conceptual tools, and overall commitment to demonstrating the contemporary relevance of Confucianism. So one aspect that particularly interests me is the methodologies employed in Professor Li's project. So Professor Li adopts the method of philosophical approach, which involves rationally reconstructing the views of historical intellectual traditions in a way that demonstrate the logical or rational relations between its elements. The goal is to assess their philosophical significance, particularly in contemporary discourse. So in this process, we take on the role of a friendly, rational reconstructor, engaging in an imagined dialogue with ancient thinkers, re-educating them by introducing ideas they may not have considered due to the historical constraints, and envisioning their views within the broader framework of their philosophical orientations. So, as Professor Li highlights in his book, this process often also needs historical reconstruction to maximize accuracy and textual exactitude, primarily through in-depth textual analysis. This approach establishes what Professor Li describes as an organic connection with the Confucian tradition, one that remains rooted in its authentic insights, while evolving naturally, thus enabling opportunities for engaging ongoing constructive dialogues. So at this point, I would like to draw our attention to another approach often used in similar projects, what some people might call it inspirational approach. So rather than focusing on reconstructing historical perspectives, this method draws upon Confucian resources as sources for inspirations for generating new philosophical insights. So it does not focus on seeking to determine what historical thinkers believed or might have believed if they were updated with contemporary knowledge or concerns. Therefore, it places relatively less emphasis on the lengthy tradition of Confucian texts and more on uncovering universal themes. And as a result, this approach seems to be often more open to integrating ideas from other foreign traditions and also forming hybrid frameworks and applying Confucian insights in more diverse global contexts. So I would be very interested in hearing Professor Li's thoughts on these two approaches. For example, how do they maybe potentially relate to each other? And does Professor Li's project perhaps leave room for incorporating elements from the inspirational approach? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophia. Perfectly.
Okay, thank you. Okay, yeah, thank you, Sophia. Very good to meet you. I take more of the philosophical approach, even though I think both the historical approach and the philosophical approach are important, and we should, use both if you take a philosophical orientation. I think if you take a historical approach, you don't necessarily go with the philosophical approach. But you do the philosophical approach, you need to use, to some extent at least, the historical approach. That is to say, in order for us to say, mention philosopher today, even though Mencius actually said certain things, a mentioned philosopher today would agree, would accept democracy. Han Feizi type of, or Shangyang type of philosopher today may still not accept democracy. In order to say that, you have to know what Mencius thought was and what Shangyang and Han Feizi philosophy was. Therefore, you need the historical approach. However, when you focus mainly on the philosophical approach, you don't need to go to the extent of a person doing history of philosophy exclusively to find out what exactly they said and to present their view along with other people's view of his time without being too selective. Or people often label as cherry picking. I think if you do the philosophical approach, you don't need to be comprehensive. All I need is Mencius actually said this. The people are the most important. And whether other people said something different, or even if Mencius said something different than that, it doesn't matter. I only need his view that he said people are the most important. I will go from there. So my view, my project is not to reconstruct the historical Mencius as he actually was in a comprehensive way. So that's the difference, even though I do use the historical approach. Now, the inspirational approach, I'm not sure, I have limited knowledge of that. From what you briefly described, it sounds like the kind of approach Professor Huang Yong has been using. As some of you know, Huang Yong has been gathering ideas from Songming Confucianism to tackle general philosophical problems even though some people would say these are Western philosophy problems, I think that they can present it in or general way. It doesn't have to be general Western philosophy. Now, the difference between Huang Yong's approach of mine, I think, I need to ask him, is that we agree that you don't have to give a comprehensive reconstruction in a historical way. He also needed to find idea from Wang Yangming or Zhu Xi, even just one single idea that is useful to solve some, is-out problem or some other ethical, moral philosophy problem that it would do for him. We differ, I think, in that my focus is reconstructing Confucianism. I want to try to still construct a Confucian-based system, even though my reconstruction is not the only progressive Confucianism today. There are many others, Steves and Ni Peiming's and Huang Yushun's, etc., etc. They are all progressive Confucianism. But that's the idea Ranjoo brought up earlier. I wanted to ground the gender equality idea we learned from the West on the Confucian idea of yin-yang philosophy. So I wanted to have a Confucian foundation for it, even though the foundation is also selective. And Huang Yong's approach, in my understanding, does not need that. He can just go with a brilliant idea from Songming philosophers and use it to tackle some general philosophical problems without focusing on reconstructing a version of Confucianism. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Prof. Li. Please allow me to introduce our last commentator and also the second speaker, Professor Stephen Angel. Prof. Stephen Angel is a Mansfield Freeman Professor at East Asian Studies and Professor of Philosophy at Wesleyan University, where he has taught since 1994. Angel's research and teaching focused on Confucian philosophy, including both in its history and its current and future development. Angel is the author or co-author of 5 books, the most recent of which is Growing Moral, A Confucian Guide to Life. He has also co-edited and contributed to 3 others, including Progressive Confucianism and its Critics. Ranjoo discovered his passion from China while a freshman at Yale in the 1980s, immersed himself in language, and went to earn a PhD in philosophy from the University of Michigan. Ranjoo's favorite comment from the students is that they find his classes among the most relevant they take, even when studying 12th century medieval Confucianism. Professor Angel, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so much. And this has been exciting already. I hope I can't wait to get questions from you all in a few minutes, because I think the questions have been really terrific, very engaging. And I think my responsibility right now is to raise a question for Chenyang. So I think I'm just going to ask one question, sort of in the interest of time. We've already had a couple exchanges, and although I'm interested in all the methodological questions that folks have been raising, I think I'm going to ask a little bit more of a substantive question, which has to do with some of what you say, Chenyang, about the idea of Confucian democracy. And so at one point, there's a very provocative statement that you make. You say, quote, "The period of exploration for Confucian democracy is over. Progressive Confucians need to move on," unquote. And I think so my question is to ask whether I correctly understand why you say that. And it seems to me that your concern is about the inability of politicians to remain true to their Confucian commitments while also being good politicians. And so, there's a sense that your Confucian moral commitments are inconsistent with what politicians have to do. Presumably, they maybe not entirely tell the truth and so on. And if that's right, if it's this sort of worry about dirty hands, as some theorists have put it, then I wonder if that's. I guess I want to push back on that, because it seems to me that that it's not the case that Confucianism demands a kind of moral purity of us, but rather it demands that we do our best to balance the different kinds of values and virtues that the Confucians articulate as we deal with the real world. And the real world can be messy. The dealing with the real world may leave moral residue on us. And I suspect this is going to come up a little bit later this evening. I think it's important for progressive Confucians, for Confucians today, to recognize the ways in which the legal system, for example, is something we have to embrace, and not something that we have to kind of pretend doesn't exist. And so, I think there's this kind of genuinely committed Confucian who is still engaged in the messy world of moral reality or political reality. And if that's right, then I wonder if why exactly we must give up on the project of Confucian democracy. So, okay. Looking forward to your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Steve. That's a very important question. First of all, what do we mean by Confucian democracy? I mean that the kind of idea that you have a political institution according to the Confucian social, political, philosophical, ideas, whether it's Jiang Qing's idea or Daniel Bell's idea, that kind of institutionalized Confucian democracy. I think what we should do is just take democracy as a political institution that everyone can participate. So the most important part of a democracy, a democratic institution, is that citizens have a right to vote. And whether it's a representative democracy or direct democracy, if a larger country like the US and China is usually representative, that is fine. But ultimately, people have to vote. My experience from Singapore, when people talk about Singapore, compare Singapore with another large country, I often correct them. I said one big difference is that in Singapore, and Elena knows this, Singapore people actually have real vote. Citizens, their vote count. I think that's a critical difference than another bigger country. You describe it in different ways. Now, the argument in another chapter you mentioned in chapter 11, the main argument, the dirty hand argument, is used against what I call the sagely politics, Confucian sagely politics. Now, you have been very careful not to go very far, with that. But traditionally, what do I mean? The idea that we can find sages. These sages will lead us, from victory to victory, like our contemporary great leaders, and they are so wise and so, good. Yeah, if only we can find them, And the Meishu said, don't worry, every 500 years there will be one. So, 500年必有圣人出, then we are okay. I think if you take the dirty hand argument seriously, sagely politics is impossible. Now, what do we have? We have ordinary people. Confucians are ordinary people. They can, as I said in the book, organize political parties that run for public office. That's fine. But we should not take them as sages or great leaders. We take them as ordinary people like we are, and we are vulnerable, we make mistakes, and we should be held accountable. So democracy allows us to do that. The various form of Confucian democracy, chosen the second chamber or this Tong Ru Yuan, those give a small group of people a special privilege, think they are different than the rest of us. I think they are residual of the sagely ideal in the ancient Confucian tradition. And today we should just put it to rest. Is democracy perfect? No, by no means. But others are even worse. That is the bottom line I have. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Prof. Li, for the presentation and for all the discussions. Then we'll come to the second section. Prof. Stephen Andrew will present his views for around 10 minutes, and every commentator could have 5 minutes, and Prof. Andrew could respond them each like 5 minutes around. Prof. Andrew, floor is yours.
Okay, so let me see here. I want to, there, if I do that, okay. So I got a share screen, I've got a PowerPoint of my own. Alrighty, so is that showing up appropriately? Thumbs up, fantastic. Okay, so,
yes.
Okay, so what is progressive Confucianism in 10 minutes or something like that? So I'm gonna try to cover 3 things. One, a little bit about the story, shamefully focused on my own sort of investigation of this question of progressive Confucianism. Go through 5 questions about how I understand that and some challenges that one might raise to it, and then end with a couple more specific implications. But so most of it's going to be pretty general, thinking more at the level of methodology. So I think that we can talk about progressive Confucianism in broad and narrow ways. So I think this is very much in the same spirit as what Chenyang was saying when he said that the Confucian tradition really has been a progressive tradition going back for 2,500 years. Insofar as one takes the tradition as takes it seriously as a living, developing tradition, you're thinking about it as progressive in this broad sense. I think it's important that this is both a theoretical and a practical undertaking. And so we can talk about what it is to theorize about the tradition as progressive Confucianism, but we can also talk about what it is to live it, what it is to find its values to have a practical significance for oneself. And then in a way that's going to be familiar from what Chenyang was saying, we have to be rooted in the tradition, but not limited to what has already been said. We have to critically accept modernity. That is, we can't pretend that we can turn back the clock. But maybe that should be critically accept modernities or something like that in response to what Elena was saying earlier. But at any rate, so something like this, I think, is a broad sense that can be applied to many different points in the development of the tradition as well as today. And so for more specific views, then we've got to look at the more individuals' development of these ideas. So here we can start to look at ways in which, sure, there's a lot of overlap between what Chenyang has just described and what I would also advocate, but there are also some differences. We can try to unpack what is underneath that, and so we get to narrower ideas. Okay, so I started explicitly talking about progressive Confucianism in this book, Contemporary Confucian Political Philosophy, where the focus is in particular on issues around democracy, rights, and law, and contrasting them with the views of some other contemporary Confucians. So that was where I got started on this project. And then in Growing Moral, which came out now 2.5 years ago, I turned much less to, not so much to political topics, but more to topics of personal development and society. And it also is written in a quite different way for a different sort of audience, less academic audience. But I think the books complement one another in a way. And then just a quick shout out to this book that just came out a few weeks ago, Progressive Confucianism and Its Critics. So the subtitle is Dialogues from the Confucian Heartland. This is a whole series of extended conversations that took place in 2017 between me and a number of so-called mainland New Confucians, mostly in Beijing, and this in some ways rehashes some of the earlier stuff, but in other ways pushes it forward. But it does it very much in the context of Sinophone debates around Confucianism. So the original plan actually was to publish this book in Chinese. By the time we got around to it, the publishers were telling us it was too politically sensitive. So for the last few years, I've been collaborating with some folks on translating this whole thing into English. So this is now the English language version. But so this is just to say that this is very much an ongoing project that is happening, I think, in multiple languages, lots of different locations around the world. So moving right along. So 5 questions, and these are questions that I raise in the chapter on progressive Confucianism in Growing Moral. And the first one is whether it's legitimate to draw, as I think Chenyang does and I do, in somewhat different ways, but we draw on a range of different Confucian thinkers and texts. And I think that is not a historical or problematic cherry picking or something like that. In my view, insofar as we have a coherent account of what is at the core of the continuing tradition that one takes oneself to be developing, which is, I think, at least a modern take on the medieval idea of the Daotong. So I would say that each progressive Confucian thinker has their own sense of a Daotong, of a set of texts and ideas on which they draw and which they think ultimately can be threaded together in a way that makes sense. And for me, at the core of that is the idea of realizing virtue in relationship. So that is realizing the virtues of all of us individuals in our sort of cooperative collective society together. And that ends up connecting up with this idea of Neishang Waiwang, or the interdependence of inner and outer, which is a view that's been important for me, I think, for a while, but it's become increasingly salient in the work that I've been doing lately. So it's not a disparate range of thinkers. It's a bunch of thinkers that you're kind of working through with a coherent idea of what the developing tradition is. Let's see, I should go faster. So does the focus on living a Confucian life that I mentioned, the sort of practical element, downplay the role of textual scholarship? This is perhaps more relevant to Growing Moral than it is to other contexts. But I guess I would just say that there's a sort of a contemporary version of the notion of the shi, of the literatus, which is all of us, right? Scholars of the tradition, and that's, I think, important. It's distinctively important to the Confucian tradition, given its focus on textual learning. But you can be a Confucian without being a Shi. So I think that one can try to adopt this way of living in a modern, progressive way without that. Let's see. I don't think we're going to talk about this so much this evening. So I do think that one can hold on to a religiosity of Confucianism, and that that's important, I think, especially in the context of conversations with mainland Chinese scholars, for whom Confucianism as lived practice as religion in some sense is very significant. Hasn't come up yet this evening, so maybe I'll leave that for later discussion if you want to bring that up. More relevant maybe for us is so progressive Confucianism on both Chenyang's account, on my account, I think on many accounts, is a much more inclusive rather than elitist undertaking. And that is different from much of historical Confucianism. And does that mean it's not Confucianism, or we're losing key insights of Confucianism? And one of the best responses, I think, here comes from a book that is has it finally come out? I can't remember, but a book by Elton Chan, where what he diagnoses the way in which the elitist organization is what he calls a permanent second best. So he's looking at the ideal that Confucians have, which is everybody becoming virtuous. And that's a difficult thing to achieve. It's very idealistic. So there's a non-ideal theory that Confucians come up with for the world as we actually live in it. And that's one of starting with the meritorious, letting them lead the way. But what ends up happening is the meritorious like being in power, and nothing ever changes. And so you get this permanent second best that has no way of actually achieving the ultimate ideal. So we need a new ideal, and it's more inclusive. And the last question, is this then, and this relates very much to what was just discussed, is this a bunch of Western ideas dressed up in Chinese clothing? And I think no, and partly that's because of the way in which you can see, I think, for many of us engaged in this project of progressive Confucianism, very much including Chenyang, that we are engaged in the real growth of a live tradition. We're talking not just about the impression that these ancient texts make on us, but on a whole range of thinkers, 20th century thinkers, 21st century thinkers, that make this a live tradition. So that's my answer to that. And then finally, the last couple points here. So what happens if we take seriously what I'm saying is really at the core, a core insight of the Confucian tradition, namely the interdependence of the inner sage and the outer king. What I mean by that is moral development depends on the possibilities afforded in the outer world, and vice versa. So we can't work towards becoming sages unless the outer world is arranged in a way that supports that. And so what does that mean for Confucianism? One thing it means, connecting up again to themes that have been mentioned, is that I think the Confucians have to critique different forms of oppression, because oppression stands in the way of inner moral growth. And in particular, insofar as a gender system is arranged in an oppressive way that limits women's opportunities, then that has to be critiqued. Not because Western feminists say it has to be critiqued. It has to be critiqued for Confucian reasons, because Confucians should want everyone to be able to become moral. And so the flip side is not just that we have to critique problematic outer arrangements, but we should also look for socio-political arrangements that encourage us to be better. And here I want to particularly give a shout out to Elena's new book, which has some really fascinating ideas about how we can try to arrange our political systems such that they result in us having morally better leaders. So she does a great job of showing why leaders are important in democracy, and how we can maybe try to get better leaders in democracy. And I don't think that Elena frames this exactly as a Confucian democracy, but it's very much a democracy and not a meritocracy, right? That's certainly a point that's important to her. And so I wonder, just sneakily getting back to the question that I asked Chenyang, I wonder if there's a broader way that we can think about Confucian democracy, not just the things that lean heavily into meritocracy, like Jiang Qing or Daniel Bell or whatever, but things that actually lean much more heavily in a democratic direction, and yet have important Confucian characteristics, things that Confucians would want to encourage. I think I've spoken long enough, so let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Andrew. So, Prof. Harry, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, actually, I'm focusing a lot more on substantive issues rather than methodological issues, but I'm going to, stand my ground. And just hold on. Let me, my computer is frozen here a little bit. Okay, all right. So again, I thank you very much for this opportunity to read carefully and comment on Steve's book. Unfortunately, I did not read it when it came out in 2012, but better late than never, and I really enjoyed it. And so again, yes, it was really like kind of eye-opening in many ways. And there are many different issues that are very interesting to me, but for the sake of time, I will limit myself to 3 aspects of the book. Progressive Confucianism, the gender dimension, and the concept of self-restriction. I'm sure, Steve, you may have had opportunities to discuss this with your critics, but unfortunately, I wasn't aware of that. So, Steve conceptualizes progressive Confucianism as an evolving philosophy to fit the new circumstances of the contemporary world, while retaining the best, most valuable, most robust insights at the core of the tradition. And the core in Confucianism is in turn centered around, and I quote, the ideal of all individuals developing their capacities for virtue, ultimately aiming at sagehood through their relationships with one another and with their environment, unquote. Now, this means that aspects of historical Confucianism that are not conducive to the promotion of the core Confucian ideal must be reformed. And I very much agree with this notion. One such aspect is the Confucian gender relation. And Steve just mentioned it very briefly, but he characterizes Confucian gender relation as gender oppression, which implies structural limitations. And I completely agree with this. And I found Steve's application of the ideas of oppression, moral luck, and burden virtues quite refreshing and convincing. As much as I agree with his analysis, I think that many Confucians might think of his proposal to be quite radical. And because if my understanding is correct, most Confucian theorists, including some contemporary ones, have assumed that sexual differences are set in stone and unchangeable, whether metaphysically or biologically. The yin-yang principle had been invoked to bolster this false notion throughout history. Now, this traditional view of Confucian gender relation was amply expressed in the 5 classics. And I believe, some people may disagree with me, but I believe that there are reasons to believe that even Kongzi and Mengzi accepted this very rigid Confucian gender relation. Hence, I found the introduction of his diagnosis of the traditional Confucian gender relation as oppression despite my agreement, rather abrupt. Although I understand that this is not the only issue he discusses in the book, and that's perhaps the reason why he had to cut to the chase. But I thought that to justify this diagnosis, it may perhaps be necessary to first address the traditional Confucian view of the gender relation as metaphysically and biologically determined. Again, this is not meant as a critique, as I essentially agree with Steve. Yet, I wondered if Steve has a response to the mainstream Confucian view of the gender relation. In my view, a refutation of such a view should be based on an idea of gender equality. And I believe this is an important preliminary step to Steve's plausible diagnosis of the Confucian gender relation as oppression. Another question I have relates to the role of self-restriction in Steve's progressive Confucianism. As I said, I endorse progressive Confucianism as characterized at the outset. Yet Steve is also careful to distinguish two senses in which Confucianism can be progressive. One involves the core Confucian commitment to individual and collective moral progress, and the other is a label for Steve's particular approach to Confucian political philosophy, which utilizes, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering the name here, Mo Zongsan's idea of self-restriction. I wholeheartedly subscribe to the progressive Confucianism in the first sense, but I am not entirely sold on the idea of self-restriction. In particular, I'm unsure whether this idea is necessary in order to defend Steve's progressive Confucian position regarding various topics. At the outset, Steve intimates that self-restriction is not an indigenous idea to Confucianism, and that Mo formulated this concept by integrating some Western philosophical ideas. Also, Steve does not endorse Mo's conception of self-restriction in its entirety, but accepts a somewhat diluted version. Hence, this is my question. Is the diluted version of self-restriction not derivable from or even compatible with classic Confucianism? Are there passages in the founder's works that clearly contradict the idea of self-restriction so understood? So, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ranjoo. Those are wonderful questions. And let me see what I can say. So, on gender, I think that it is true what you're saying, that the argument that I'm making is a strong argument, and one that is pretty distant from many particular mainland Confucians who talk about this question of gender. I think that in the sort of relatively small community of Anglophone philosophers talking about Confucianism and gender, there's a broader range there, and for some it's less of a stretch. But I take your point, and I'll say a couple things then in response. One is that I think it's important that there is some groundwork that's already been done within the Confucian tradition before the modern period to begin bringing up to begin problematizing the way that gender is understood in traditional Chinese society. So by the time we get to the Ming Dynasty, the conventional wisdom in Chinese society is that women are inferior to men. It's utterly explicit, and that women can only aspire to a watered down kinds of feminine virtues, and not to the full virtue of humaneness and righteousness and so on. However, there are voices within the tradition, female voices within the tradition, who push back against that. And so the idea of equality, at least in terms of the kind of virtue that one can aspire to and the human nature that people have. So my favorite example is from the Inner Teachings by Ming Dynasty Empress, who says very explicitly that women have the same human nature, they can aspire to the same virtues, women can become sages. So there is a dispute within the tradition. And a Ming Dynasty philosopher, male philosopher, also, I think, actually identifies some of the structural problems that I go on to talk about. He doesn't advocate changing anything, but there is a degree to which that structural worry, I think, has been noticed. So there's at least something that I'm building on. It's not coming out of nowhere. And while there's been, at least to my knowledge, almost no discussion among Sinophone Confucians of the distinction between biological sex and gender, almost none, but there has been some. There's a book that came out in 2022 by Fang Xudong, who does mark that distinction, and there's a fair amount of ambiguity, but seems to accept the importance of that distinction. And there's been some discussion by sort of more feminist scholars of what's going on in Professor Fang's book. So I think there's a little bit of movement, and of course, what you can publish and so on is very limited around some of these issues sometimes. But so the ground may be a little bit more fertile for talking about the relatively radical views that I'm suggesting than it appears. And then finally, on the self-restriction, right, it's a big topic. I guess what I'll say is I think that it is very important for any philosophical approach that foregrounds virtue, that thinks that the cultivation of virtue and the achievement of individual virtue is important. It's critical that tradition has a way for understanding how objective institutions can put checks on any individual, no matter how virtuous they claim to be. And I think that this is an issue not just for Confucianism. It's an issue for Aristotle. It's an issue for Hume, for any sort of virtue-based tradition. And depending, it's not that Aristotle has nothing to say about law. Hume obviously has things to say about law as well. But this notion of self-restriction at its core is the idea that individuals have to recognize the authority of objective institutions that come from politics or law, rather than simply relying on our own moral judgment. And I think that there's not a super good basis for this in the tradition. Certainly, you can find some subtle discussions of the relationship between institutions and moral growth. In Xunzi and his talk about Fa and Li and so on, for sure. But I think that this is something that many pre-modern traditions turn out to need, Confucianism among them. But more to be said. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Prof. Andrew. Prof. Ziliotti, here's your turn.
Yeah. Hi, Stephen. Thanks for the nice presentation. I really enjoyed it. My comment is a short comment, and I want just to know more about what you think about between the relationship of progressive Confucianism and value pluralism. So what is and how progressive Confucianism can accommodate value pluralism. And the reason I'm asking this is because, as you write in your 2012 book, you think that accepting the fundamental human virtues that Confucians had valued since ancient time is what is part of what is to be Confucian. And I think this, methodologically speaking, gives us a strong basis to understand when we have progress and when we don't. And so there can be a lot of trial and errors, and in trying to realize these virtues at the individual level or social level, and so that we can also understand, therefore, when we have progress and when we are not there yet. But this also led me think whether progressive Confucianism can deal with contemporary pluralistic society in a way that can accommodate value pluralism, given that only a small minority, if any, adheres to Confucian principle. We will see after many people read Growing More, but we never know. But even in contemporary East Asia, very few people certify them as Confucians. And so the question is how we relate with value pluralism, because one option that we have on the table is Sung Moon Kim's approach. Think of accommodating value pluralism by rethinking Confucianism, not so much as a philosophical tradition, but rather as a way of life, the way of life of contemporary East Asian. So he is really proposing what I call an empirical turn in the philosophical debate, right? And this has a certain advantage because he can easily accommodate, I mean, not easily, but that can lead a possibility to accommodate value pluralism. But I think that progressive Confucians might not want to take the empirical turn, primarily because progressive Confucianism has, in your presentation and also Chenyang's presentation have explained, progressive Confucianism is based also on, or embraces the aim to continue to value the texts of classical Confucians, and also to view Confucianism as an intellectual tradition that can or should assume a normative role in contemporary societies and beyond. So I suspect, and correct me if I misunderstood, but I think that progressive Confucians will not really accept an empirical turn. They want to hold on to Confucianism has a philosophical tradition that has still a lot of things to say. And so then, what other possibilities do we have to embrace value pluralism? Because one option is that we think of Confucianism as a very important philosophical and ethical tradition that gives to individual guidance on how to live and coexist in a fast-changing world. But if we look at Confucianism just as an individual ethics, yes, of course, we have probably resolved the issue of value pluralism because everybody can freely choose whether to practice Confucian ideas and values or not. But we give away maybe too much of the Confucian tradition, namely also the richness that we have at the political level of the tradition. So my question is, how is there a strategies that we can develop to engage with value pluralism, but also show that the progressive Confucianism has a lot of things to say when it comes to politics? And so my question is really about your first 2012 book, because my hunch is that we can have two different approaches. We can conceptually, we can renovate fundamental Confucian political concepts that are not in line with with pluralism. But another option that I think is already happening is what you do, for example, in the book with political participation. So you say there has never been a justification of the moral values of political participation, but I can use certain kinds of classical Confucian and neo Confucian ideas to recreate a new concept of political participation that is Confucian-based or Confucian-inspired. I just want to to hear what we think about these issues. Thank you so much.
Wow, fantastic. So I think value pluralism is an extremely important issue for just exactly the reasons that you say. Before I briefly speak to that, I want to. I was really fascinated with one of your questions for Chenyang about the worries about progress and its connection with colonial projects and so on. And I wanted to first of all endorse what Chenyang said about a sort of Rortian pragmatist way of thinking about progress. That seemed to me to be very helpful. And there's a point in one of his essays where Rorty says that what he hopes for is that future people are going to look back on us and think that, boy, they were doing okay. Right. But that there's no clear, end goal. It's sort of ongoing. And so that seems to me to be very helpful. I also think that, so for example, on the one hand, I emphasize again and again the importance of decentering the West in a variety of ways. But at the same time, especially when I'm talking with mainland Confucians, it's still important to emphasize these, sort of modern institutions of law and rights. And so I think that they are much too quick to be willing to abandon things like that and move on, partly with gestures towards post-colonialism and so on. So I think we can decenter the West, but still recognize the value of certain of these modern innovations on that issue. On value pluralism, okay, so I've been thinking about this in part because you raise an issue like this in your book, which I recently wrote a review of, a very favorable review, which will be coming out soon, I think. So I think it's a great question, and I don't know whether I have a good answer or not. But what I thought of was the way in which, and I don't know if you know this guy, P.C. Zhang Pengjun, who was one of the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So he's a nationalist Chinese intellectual and diplomat. And in the context of that very pluralist environment of trying to come together and shape a single agreement, he does two things. One thing is he pushes back against the use of God, because he says that is something which many of the people in the room, as they're talking about it, agree with, but is still too culturally specific and would alienate, the people that he's representing. And so partly because of his influence, there is no reference to God in the Universal Declaration. At the same time, he thinks that there are ideas coming from the Confucian tradition, the Chinese tradition, but the Confucian tradition, that are of universal significance, even though they were articulated first in the context of China. And in particular, he's thinking of Ren, of humaneness or benevolence, and he pushes for a while. And there's a lot of discussion back and forth, and in the end, the concept is sort of brought into the very first article of the UDHR, where it's referenced as conscience. So conscience is perhaps not the world's best translation. It's not really a translation of Ren, but it is there in the spirit of Ren. And so, I think that on the one hand, this is an example of someone who is, sort of, if we squint, we can imagine that he's representing a kind of a Confucian comprehensive doctrine, right? So there's a broader set of Confucian ideas that he's committed to. But in the context of the UDHR, he's not in a position to say, my ideas have to go in here, right? but the balancing of those two things, no God, and let's find a way to include, in a sense that's intelligible to the rest of the group, this Confucian idea, seems to me to be not a bad way to go, and should in fact be the right way to think about all concepts, because all concepts have a contingent history. They came up in a particular place and language and so on and so forth. So it's not like God, for example, is universal. It's not. So that's at least a starting point for maybe a way to go. And so I think that's not that different from what you do with Ren and public spiritedness in your book, right? And so we can always ask questions about, well, is that the best way to sort of reframe something in a shared public space? But anyways, so super question. I'm still thinking about it, but that's what I've got for right now.
Can I add something to what Steve said?
Yeah, of course.
Very briefly, my view is that most values, most important values in most world traditions overlap, even though they are formulated in different ways, and there are overlapping formulations of similar ideas. In that way, even though we have different traditions, different philosophies, our shared value actually is a huge amount. That's the first point. Second point, each tradition, each philosophy differ from others, not in the main shared values, rather in the way they prioritizing certain values. If you are Confucian, you prioritize certain values, then a non-Confucian tradition does. And what to resolve that difference? We engage in dialogue, communication, and politically. I think this is probably Elena is having questioning after. Politically, I think if we have a neutral political institution of democracy, then we go to the voting booth to decide. For example, in Singapore, if you live close to your parents, you get a tax cut, a financial benefit. Now that clearly can be behind it, there is a family value there. What if I disagree? I'm a modern Westerner, I don't think that's important. Well, then we go to the voting booth to decide which representative we want to put in the office, and legislators, they decide. So we have a democratic way to figure out that difference. So these 2 points I want to add. That's my view. Thank you. It's an important question.
Thank you, Prof. Li. Sophia, please ask your question.
Okay, I just turned on the audio. Thank you so much. Many thanks to Professor Engels for the insightful presentation, and I deeply resonate with Professor Engels' commitment to progressive Confucianism, and I'm particularly fascinated by his insights on the contemporary relevance of Confucian political philosophy. And I also would like to take this opportunity to recommend everyone Professor Engels' recent paper titled My Progressive Confucian Journey. I found it truly inspiring and encouraging, uplifting, and I believe it holds particular relevance for many in our audience today. Okay, so I think my comments may overlap somewhat with thoughts previously shared by our commentators and presenters, and also my own comments given earlier. So in my understanding, Professor Engels' project of progressive Confucianism emphasizes on the importance of grounding firmly in Confucian philosophical thinking and the need to incorporate other foreign resources in ways that further its own development. In this spirit, integrating or incorporating feminist concerns into Confucianism can be understood as about ensuring its continued growth and relevance. So that said, I want to raise a question for reflection. Is feminist progressive Confucianism, that is a form of feminism rooted in Confucianism, necessary for Confucian women. This becomes important when considering whether their Confucian women's adherence to Confucianism is essential for their flourishing, or their adherence is primarily contingent on social, cultural, or historical factors, and how it might intersect with feminist concerns. And this question becomes also particularly relevant when we consider the potential tensions between preserving Confucian thoughts and advancing feminist concerns. So, to give an example, as we know, Confucian generals in their various historical forms have been entrenched in Chinese society since the 5th century BCE. While these rules have surely historical significance, they might be inadequate for addressing issues for gender equality, which is central for contemporary family ethics. So this inadequacy stems from historical limitations, including economic and technological constraints, and an excessive emphasis on social stability and harmony, and a general oversight of social equality, particularly gender equality. To address these challenges, progressive approaches often need to adapt Confucian role ethics in line with contemporary needs. This may involve expanding traditional roles to reflect the diversity of relationships in contemporary worlds, and also enriching them to accommodate the complexities arising from the intersections of diverse roles, and also interdependencies in a globalized world. However, while we revise our understanding of traditional roles, along with the associated rituals and virtues, that is crucial. But such updates are often very complex and require long-term effort. So in the meantime, legal protections are essential to provide immediate and tangible safeguards, particularly for care providers who are often women and who frequently occupy more vulnerable positions within both family structures and society at large. So this is especially pressing when entrenched social attitude and institutional structures rooted in historical norms resist changes and continue to pose significant threats to care providers' well-being. So, however, given, as we know, Confucius' well-known skepticism of law, I am wondering how should we navigate this tension between integrating legal protections within progressive Confucian projects while still grounding these efforts firmly in Confucian thinking. And I greatly look forward to hearing Professor Engel's thoughts on this matter. Thank you so much.
All right, Sophia, thank you very much. And I think that the question about the need for legal protections versus the skepticism of law, in a way, nicely connects back up to Ranjoo's question about self-restriction and some other things that have been said before. Confucius, so famously thought it was critical for us to for our societies and our leaders and our role models to encourage us to cultivate virtue rather than to follow coercive laws because we were afraid of the punishments. Right, so that's sort of a founding insight of the tradition, and I think in many ways that's exactly correct. That a society that just tries to organize itself around threatened punishments if you do the wrong thing is going to fail as a society. It is essential to think seriously about virtue, but there's a flip side, which is the importance of providing protections for a whole range of sort of fundamental human activities. Right. So the Confucian tradition is great at saying you must speak truth to power, but they do very little to protect you when you speak truth to power, and so on. And so it's thoughts like that that have led me inspired by Mo Zhongshan and others, to say that there is an important lack within the Confucian tradition, which is a lack of recognition of the positive function played by legal restrictions. And to some degree, there's a naivete within the tradition about it's okay, we'll have sages do it. We'll have sages in charge. But of course, they're not really that naive. And there are a lot of institutions that get discussed, right? But I think not then theorized in the way that Mo did, and that I've and others have followed him in doing so. So I think that the need for laws and rights is very important. And then the question is, but I think it's an innovation. I think it's not something that straightforwardly builds out of ideas in the tradition already. And then you have the question about, well, is that then in tension with, or does it undermine other key things about Confucianism? And so Justin Seawald and others have argued that there is a tension, that the presence of rights, of a system of rights, can potentially lead to the undermining of affection that we have for one another, and things of that nature. So what I've tried to argue for is what I call at one point law as a system of second resort. That is, it's not something that we resort to immediately in times of conflict, but it isn't something that is so difficult to access that people never can really do it. And in order to make that happen, we have to find a way to, as Confucians, to embrace the importance of law and not to worry about it as something that is going to set us at odds with one another. So, I think that Confucians should be able to celebrate the way that law enables our freedom and growth. And so there's a sense of, self-restriction is focusing on a kind of a negative thing in the way that it's phrased, whereas in fact, what's important about law is its positive function in enabling us to realize our humanity imperfectly, but that's the best we can do. So I see the time. I'll stop there, but thanks very much, Sophia, and look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you. Perfectly. Maybe the last question. I can't hear you.
Yeah. I think we only have a couple of minutes. Let's give the audience one chance at least to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you, perfectly. So if anyone has question, you could just hands up or test the question in the chat. Hi, Justin, please.
Yes, first of all, thanks for this really rich and interesting discussion. I enjoyed it a great deal. It's good to see you all, colleagues. So I'll make it really fast. I loved the question raised by Elena, which I also thought addressed, more or less raised the question of pluralism, whether we can have progressive Confucianism along with some pluralistic conception of value and thus a pluralistic conception of progress. It seems like Steve embraces that. He embraces a kind of value pluralism. I was wondering what Chenyang thought about whether his progressivism was compatible with pluralism, in particular because the interjection that you just made in the midst of Steve's discussion suggests to me that you think there's so much overlap that in fact perhaps there isn't much room for pluralism, that all the great traditions perhaps draw upon a shared set of values, although you did allow that there are different priorities.
Thank you. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. I think different traditions, different philosophies can disagree strongly on certain points on which value to prioritize when it comes to conflict or compete with other values. I have called the different ways of prioritizing values the configuration of values, cultural configuration values. That is to say, Confucianism, the mainstream and least, configure its value priority in one way, and that may be different from another tradition. And I think that is actually one of the contention between Confucianism and Moism, for example. It's not that you can find they only each have only one value, they are entirely different. They embrace a bunch of values and most of them overlap. I think that is still the case today with different traditions. Often when we talk about the conflict of civilizations, clash of civilizations, I think is in one civilization, the more progressive one is, leading against another civilization where the more or less backward one is leading, and there often there is a clash. Most civilizations or cultures, if they are all progressive according to the time, there is little conflict. That's my view. So I don't see not such a big clash between different traditions today. I think if there is, you can talk to different voices in the same tradition, you will find they disagree among themselves. And if there is a clash, that is because in one tradition is more, leading by the progressive one, and the other tradition may be leading by more backward, conservative one. And so there is as much clash between culture and civilization as within each culture and traditions. So that's my view on that. I hope I kind of answer your question.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you for attending, Justin.
Yeah, thank you. So, are there any other questions from the audience? May I also ask a question about the relation about the progressive harmony, especially with the character Prof. Li mentioned at the very beginning about the 和 you use the word 太和 and you translate it as the progressive harmony. May I ask about the relation between the 太和 rather than 和? How does it related to the progressive Confucianism?
Okay, very briefly for the sake of time. The English term I used there is dynamic harmony, as because harmony in English in Western language often is understood as pure agreement or conformity. I think the Confucian idea of 和 is more dynamic. It includes diversity, and I translate 太和 rather than just 和, rather use just 和 太和, because I think it's I use that concept not only in the social political domain as an ethical, social political concept. Actually, it's also a metaphysical concept. And if you read Zhangzai, for example, or the I Ching tradition, you will find it is the very metaphysical foundation of Confucian philosophy. So I put it first as the first concept, and the indicated 太和 goes all the way to the very foundation of Confucian as a philosophy, the metaphysical dimension, as well as social political dimension. Thank you for your question, Luyao.
Thank you, Prof. Li. Is there any other questions? If anyone has a question, you could just hands up or yeah, Will Gilbert, please.
Yes. Thank you both for your presentations. I really enjoyed that. I was curious if you are familiar at all with the philosophical movement in Korea, the Joseon Dynasty, known as Shilhak. Practical learning is how it's translated often, because I think that I haven't had the chance to read either of your books on this subject yet, but this movement could provide like very practical, like tangible instances of, yeah, something that maybe could be called like a progressive Confucianism, which was directly like a reaction against a more, yeah, reactionary kind of traditional Confucianism. So yeah, I'm just curious if you're familiar with that movement at all. Thank you.
Steve, are you familiar with that? I confess I'm not.
Not super familiar, but there's a similar thing going on in China, with so 实学 is Xinhak, I think, and so I guess one of the interesting things is, does progressive Confucianism require abandoning the highfalutin metaphysics of Songming Neo-Confucianism, right? Because I think Xinhak in Korea is reacting against the dominant Jushi strain of Neo-Confucianism in Korea, just as you have similar ideas going on in China, and I guess I think that's an open question, that exactly what to make of metaphysical and or religious sorts of views that we find within the Confucian tradition today, is not something we've been talking about. We've been talking more about ethical and political subjects, but it seems to me that probably a just very literal adoption of Neo-Confucian metaphysics in the contemporary world is a non-starter. But there've been some people who've written really, really interestingly about ways that something that is at the very least inspired, to use Sophia's word, but maybe inspired in a rich and rooted way by ideas like pattern, Tianli, things like that, really can resonate with certain strands of modern kind of systems thinking and so on and so forth. That's if you go in a more philosophical way. If you go in a more sort of religious way, it seems to me that the notion of a value-laden cosmos, where there's the possibility of harmony within it, is also not something that is just a non-starter. So Xinhak might say no, but I think there's a plurality of different ways that we can develop progressive Confucianism in a contemporary context. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Thank you, Perfect Andrew, Perfect Li, and thank you for all. Thank you for you all to come to our discussion. And I think time is up. So have a nice day. See you guys.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Hi,
Bye.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.